السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. لعله نظام فصل عنصري، وما هو أكثر توحشا الوضع القائم في فلسطين المحتلة وغزة لسنوات على مرأى ومسمع ما يعرف بالمجتمع الدولي، حيث فرضت إسرائيل على فلسطين واقع الفصل العنصري في عالم ما بعد الفصل العنصري واندثاره. نظام الفصل العنصري الإسرائيلي هذا كان وما زال واضحا في ممارساته المتوحشة البغيضة المقيتة التي باتت مرادفا له، مثل الاستيلاء على الأراضي وهدم المنازل والتطهير القسري وإنشاء المستوطنات، مع التغييرات الديمغرافية غير القانونية والتجزئة الاستراتيجية للمنطقة والمحاولات الحثيثة لسلب الهوية الثقافية الفلسطينية المتجذرة في هذه الأرض وهذا الشعب العنيد. وتستمر انتهاكات حقوق الإنسان التي تمارسها سلطة الاحتلال، ولا سيما هدم المنازل وطرد الفلسطينيين من أرضهم، ويستمر استهداف المدنيين والأطفال الفلسطينيين. وشكلت هذه عمليات قتل خارج نطاق القانون ترافقها اعتداءات يومية على المتظاهرين وانتهاكات عند نقاط التفتيش، ومنع المرضى من الفلسطينيين من التنقل ممن يحتاجون إلى علاج طبي. وتستمر الاعتقالات ومعاناة الأسرى الفلسطينيين بلا هوادة بمن فيهم النساء والأطفال والمرضى، ويستمر الاستيلاء على الموارد الطبيعية. وفي خضم كل هذا تستمر قوة الاحتلال في التمتع بالإفلات من العقاب والمحاسبة، وقد انتهكت إسرائيل انتهاكا صارخا التزاماتها بموجب القانون الدولي، وحرمت الشعب الفلسطيني من التمتع بحقوقه غير القابلة للتصرف، بما في ذلك حق تقرير المصير وحق العودة. كانت إسرائيل وما فتئت ترتكب جريمة الفصل العنصري في الأراضي الفلسطينية، ويجب بحسب مقرري الأمم المتحدة وحقوق الإنسان تفكيك نظام الفصل العنصري هذا بكل الوسائل القانونية. وكان من واجب المجتمع الدولي إنهاء هذا الوضع المؤسف والمزري وغير الإنساني بكل المعايير بالأمس قبل اليوم. يطيب لنا في هذا السياق أن نستقبل من مدينة لندن في مقاطعة أونتاريو في كندا المحامي المختص في قانون حقوق الإنسان مايكل لينك، المقرر الخاص السابق للأمم المتحدة المعني بحالة حقوق الإنسان في الأراضي الفلسطينية المحتلة من 2016 إلى 2022. خلال فترة ولايته واجه لينك انتقادات شديدة من الأصوات المؤيدة لإسرائيل، ومنعته إسرائيل حتى من زيارة فلسطين المحتلة. ومع ذلك فقد ميز نفسه بشكل ملحوظ خلال فترة ولايته التي استمرت 6 سنوات، وأصدر تقريرا نهائيا خلص فيه إلى أن إسرائيل تمارس الفصل العنصري. أهلا بكم إلى حلقة جديدة من الداخل، معكم زينب صفار، تابعونا. Professor Michael Link, former UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the occupied Palestinian territories from the year 2016 to 2022, and attorney at law, expert in constitutional and human rights law, joining us from the city of London, Ontario in Canada. Welcome to Min al-Dakhil from the Inside, sir.
Thank you very much for having me. A great pleasure to be here.
Pleasure to have you always. Well, Dr. Link, you observed that the past 6 years had been momentous with regards to developments in the occupied Palestinian territories. Most of these developments had been disheartening and an affront to international human rights standards. You described the Israeli occupation that it had curdled from, quote, an endless occupation into something darker, harsher, and more ominous. We would appreciate a holistic and thorough leap into your apartheid report to the United Nations last March 2022 towards the end of your tenure, please.
Thank you for that. When I first became special rapporteur in the spring of 2016, I thought that the last thing I would ever be doing was to write a report on apartheid. It seemed to me that if I spoke about apartheid, I would be having doors closed in front of me. I wouldn't be able to speak to political decision makers. Diplomats wouldn't listen to me. And so what I thought I was going to do, and this is what I did for the first 4 or 5 years of my mandate as special rapporteur, was to focus on Israeli breaches of international human rights law and international humanitarian law. So I wrote about the right to health, the right to natural resources. I wrote about accountability of international organizations and states in their failure to hold Israel to account for its breaches of international law, for its breaches of UN resolutions. But as I was becoming towards the end of my tenure, say this time last year, I began to realize that this occupation, this 55-year-old occupation of Israel, by Israel, of the Palestinian territory, East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza, well, the term occupation and the framework of international humanitarian law no longer accurately captured what was going on. This was
annexation. What was going on, sir?
Well, essentially this, is that Israel had made it very clear that they were going to rule between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea permanently. That Palestinians were going to get no rights under international law or under domestic law. That there always would be a segregated, systemic, discriminatory system in place between Jews and Palestinians. And this seems to me to meet the definition of apartheid. So it was, to me, it changed my mind as I began to explore this more deeply. And that's why I concluded in my 12th and final report that certainly in the occupied Palestinian territory, this was apartheid. How else, what other term do you have in the international vocabulary to describe a situation where one group of people live with all of the rights and privileges of citizenship, of high standards of living in deeply segregated communities, and the indigenous people, the vast majority, live with no rights at all, either under domestic or international law, suffer from inhumane acts, and have no prospect of independence or self-determination on their political horizon. There's no other word in the English language or in the international political vocabulary to describe this but apartheid.
In a similar context, sir, Israel's 11-day bombardment of the Gaza Strip in May of 2021 amount to war crimes, according to Human Rights Watch. And the Israeli forces, of course, carried out attacks that devastated entire families without any apparent military target nearby. And these are the words of Human Rights Watch, noting that Israel's consistent unwillingness to seriously investigate alleged war crimes underlines the need for the International Criminal Court's inquiry. What is to be said here on the lack of international accountability in holding Israel responsible as it violates international law?
The Israeli-Palestinian issue is one of the most, probably the most visible and well-known international crisis in the modern world. It's been going on from 1947 and even earlier than that. It is the best documented series of human rights violations. There are numerous and very professional Israeli, Palestinian, and international organizations such as Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, which you've mentioned, who have documented over and over again the trend and the pattern of violations of humanitarian and human rights law. And yet the international community, with this wealth of information in front of it, chooses, if you like, the path of willful blindness in not wanting to impose meaningful accountability measures, some call them sanctions, on Israel in order to bring it back in line with international law and UN resolutions. An international community which allows one of its members to go rogue, as it allows Israel, in fact itself is going rogue by not committing themselves to what they've said on paper. The the immense body of human rights and humanitarian law that we've built up in this world over the past 75 years applies with vigor to Israel. The Security Council has said that. The General Assembly has said that. The Human Rights Council has said that. And yet, particularly among the key decision makers in North America and in Europe, there is no appetite at all for wanting to challenge Israel. They're content to allow Israel to manage this conflict and show no path for a political future for the Palestinians. And so what would you expect when there is constant rebellion by a population that doesn't want to be ruled by an alien country and an alien power?
True. During your mandate, Dr. Link, you have faced intense criticism from pro-Israel voices, and Israel even banned you from visiting occupied Palestine. Tell us more about your overall experiences as a UN Special Rapporteur in this regard and the impediments that you have faced.
Sure. It was clear when I first became Special Rapporteur in May of 2016 that I was not going to be able to enter into Israel or the occupied Palestinian territory. I had written, and I continue to write, each year when I wanted to make a visit to the region, to the Israeli permanent mission in Geneva, that I was planning to visit, and I would like to be able to receive a detailed assurance that I would be able to do so. Silence. That's all I ever received was silence from Israel. So look, my plan B was to go to Amman, to meet with human rights groups, to meet with the United Nations officials based in Palestine, to read the many professional reports that are put out by Palestinian and Israeli and international human rights groups on the human rights violations being committed by Israel in the occupied territory. This is the best documented human rights crisis in the modern world, as I said before. So that helped me inform the 12 reports that I wrote over the past 6 years to the UN on what was going on. Would it meant a difference to me if I was able to enter into Palestine and Israel? Yes, it would. I think I have enough statistics, I have enough law to be able to say accurately what is going on there. But it would have helped my reports had I been able to meet the victims of human rights abuses, to be able to tell their stories, to be able to see with my own eyes what military occupation actually means for Palestinians in Gaza or East Jerusalem or the West Bank. As it is, I think my reports stand by themselves as a solid piece of UN reporting.
Maybe, sir, yes, they didn't want you to see that there had been several periods of an Israeli spree of intense and destructive violence with great loss of life and property against the Palestinians under the occupation by the Israeli military, particularly in Gaza. I would appreciate if you can tell us more about the situation in Gaza.
Sure. You know, there is no place in the modern world that I can think of where you have an alien power barricading in a medieval siege a large population, and we're talking about 2 million plus people living in Gaza. Probably 90% of them have never been outside of the Gaza Strip in their entire lives. A very young population, around 70% of the population in Gaza is under the age of 30. It has an economy that's flat on its back. The World Bank says that the unemployment rate in Gaza is around between 45 and 50%, which is the highest unemployment rate in any economic unit that the World Bank looks at. Its healthcare system is flat on its back, with an inability to be able to import medical medicines and medical equipment to be able to meet the health needs of the population. 97% of the one water aquifer, the coastal aquifer underneath Gaza, is undrinkable because of pollution by sewage and seawater. So you can go power. You know, Gazans have somewhere between 4 and 12 hours of power each day. That's all. So you can imagine having to live your lives with a planning about what goes into the fridge, what doesn't go into the fridge, when you shop, and so on. It has a very low per capita income, much lower than the West Bank and East Jerusalem. So the kind of siege that is imposed upon Gaza, and the many wars since 2008, 2009, 2012, 2014, the Great March of Return, 2018,
18.
and the bombardment in 2021. All of this has drawn independent commissions of inquiry coming from the UN Human Rights Council to examine what happened and what should be the recommendations going to the international community. In each occasion, these international reports have said there is an accountability crisis. Israel does not investigate the violence and the human rights violations that its military commits, and there is no meaningful accountability imposed by the international community for the thousands of deaths and the millions and millions of dollars of destruction imposed upon Gaza by this repeated cycle of wars and violence visited upon it. Unless and until the international community is willing to stand up to Israel, demand accountability, and bring an end to the occupation, I'm afraid we're going to continue seeing these patterns.
Sir, in a similar vein, the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs' recent report calling for the lifting of blockade against the Gaza Strip, the humanitarian impact of 15 years of the blockade, which was issued in 2022, last June, has pointed out to all the minute details on how you describe the situation currently in Gaza. My question is, though the report has been well received by Gaza leaders, don't we still find in this report a certain level of contradiction, as the resolution 1860 at the very end of the 2009 attacks was not calling for the full lifting of the Gaza blockade, sir?
Look, my recommendations are very similar to what the world international community has been calling for some time. The Security Council in 2009 called for a lifting of the blockade. The European Union and the European Parliament have called for a lifting of the blockade. The Secretary General of the United Nations, three of them have called for a lifting. Two of them have called for a lifting of the blockade. What this means is that there should be freedom of movement, which is a basic human right enjoyed universally by all of us, no matter where we are in the globe. The Palestinian economy the blockade has to be lifted in order to allow both the export of Gazan goods and the import of goods into Gaza. Yes, there has to be security measures, but those can be done with, I think, some unity between Israel, the Palestinian Authority, Hamas, and the international community. This blockade does not need to continue in order to ensure both security for Israel and prosperity for the Palestinians. There's always going to be a change in perception and a change in diplomacy with respect to this. But I think the Resolution 1860 in January of 2009 is worded in such a way that you can reliably say it means the lifting of the blockade and the allowance of freedom of movement for Gazans. As long as Gaza continues to be separated from Palestinians in Israel, but most importantly, Palestinians in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, you're going to have the inability of being able to create a genuine Palestinian state, if there is such a possibility still left. Benjamin Netanyahu once was asked in his own cabinet, why are you allowing money to flow from Gulf states into Gaza in order to be able to keep the economy going? And he said, every dollar that goes into Gaza means the increasing unlikelihood of a Palestinian state. The more aid being given to Hamas in Gaza means no Palestinian state in the future, no unity among the Palestinians. So if we understand that is the strategy of the Israeli government to keep Palestinians from Gaza and the West Bank and East Jerusalem apart from one another, then we understand the strategic necessity of Israel to maintain this, and the strategic importance, on the other hand, of the international community to demand the lifting of this blockade.
Right. International law was not meant, you said that, sir, that it was not meant to be an umbrella that folded up at the first hint of rain. Had the international community accompanied these resolutions with resolute accountability and consistency decades ago, we wouldn't have had this heinous situation and occupation persist. Here, what is the role of the United Nations in this sense, sir?
Look, at its very best, the United Nations is the forum for the Palestinians to be able to
I mean, is it
present
just, bound to write reports and that's it?
Let's hope not. Yes, I'm one of those people who writes reports when I was special rapporteur. But the point of every single one of my reports and the reports of the special rapporteurs before me, and I'm sure the special rapporteur who's now succeeded me, is to stir the world's conscience, and particularly the conscience of North America and Europe, to compel them to do something, because criticism without consequences means only a deeper occupation and an entrenched apartheid in Israel and Palestine. And you're certainly right when you said my call with respect to obeying international law. I think I said when I introduced my report on apartheid to the Human Rights Council back in March of this year, I said, if the international community had followed its own law, international law, and its own multiple resolutions from the Security Council, the General Assembly, and the Human Rights Council 35 years ago and 45 years ago, I wouldn't have been up at the stand in Geneva issuing a report on apartheid, because the problem would have been solved long ago. The outline for a solution for Israel and Palestine has been known for decades and decades. The problem is Israel refuses to accept it. Israel demands the ability to keep on colonizing, because there's no better word than that, colonizing Palestinian territory in order to be able to expand its boundaries and expand its control of one people over another. That's the issue of Israel and Palestine in a nutshell.
Who are the Palestinian interlocutors for stopping, for example, the Gaza blockade, considering all major parties there are collaborating with each other, but they are all considered as so-called terrorist groups by the US and also by the EU? So wouldn't it be a prerequisite to drop that sort of classification and branding, at least from the EU side, in order to plan for the concrete lifting of the blockade, and how to engage directly with the local de facto governing authorities and their local allies?
Yes. Look, one doesn't have to be a believer or a supporter in either the goals or the tactics and strategy of Hamas to realize that they are a major player with respect to Israel and Palestine, and they have to be brought into negotiations as a party. I spent a week in late March 2022, after having delivered my report in Geneva, in Ireland. And in Ireland offers all kinds of interesting parallels for approaching our understanding of Israel and Palestine. And among others, the British would have abhorred the strategy and tactics of the IRA during the 1970s and 1980s into the 1990s. But they realized they had to talk to the IRA along with other political representatives of the people in Northern Ireland in order to be able to get a Good Friday Agreement. And that's the same issue here. You don't talk to your friends when you want peace, you talk to your enemies. And if Israel is an enemy of Hamas and vice versa, then it means talking to them, including them, and beginning to, if you like, hand them the responsibility of showing that they can act in a professional and political fashion to bring an end to the dispute, as long as the goals laid out in international human rights law are met. If you want to deliberately excluding Hamas, you are prolonging the conflict.
Right. Yes, the amount of violence that Israel was using to maintain its occupation was ever growing, and I'm borrowing your words, sir. The international community, in particular the United Nations, must ensure the safeguarding of the rights of the Palestinian people. Yes, those who stood on the side of an apartheid regime stood on the wrong side of history. Yes, it is the legitimate right of all the Palestinians to resist occupation within the framework of international law, and with every and by all means available to them to end this occupation and this apartheid. Professor Michael Link, former UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the occupied Palestinian territories, many thanks indeed for joining us, sir, and for all your incessant efforts to expose the reality of what was going on in the occupied territories.
And thank you very much for having me. It's been a great pleasure.
It's a great pleasure to have you, sir. ودائما الشكر لكم مشاهدينا الكرام على طيب المتابعة. للتفاعل أكثر تابعونا على صفحات السوشيال ميديا، وحتى نلتقي من كل فريق عمل من الداخل من كل الميادين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.